There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a room when someone says something that cannot be unsaid. It is not the silence of boredom or distraction. It is not the polite pause between sentences at a dinner party. It is the silence of reckoning, the kind that sits heavy in the chest of everyone present, the kind that forces even the most powerful people in the room to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Amara Ellis had heard that silence before. She had grown up in the spaces between languages, between cities, between versions of herself built and abandoned like temporary homes. She knew what it meant when a room went still. It meant someone had just shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. She just never expected to be the one doing the shifting. What you are about to hear is the story of a woman who carried an entire world inside her. 9 languages, 12 countries, 31 years of learning how to survive alone, and walked into a boardroom in Miami, not knowing that the life she was about to save was her own. It is also the story of a man who had everything except the one thing that would make all of it mean something. And it is the story of what happens when envy wears the face of elegance, and the truth refuses to stay buried.
I can help. I speak 9 languages.
If this story moves you, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us, what language does your heart speak? The conference room on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Miami skyline like a painting. And on the morning of March 14, 2024, every seat at that glass table was occupied by someone who believed they were the most important person in it. Amara Ellis was not one of those people. She knew exactly where she stood, and it was not at the table. She had arrived at Park Meridian Holdings 8 weeks earlier as a contract executive assistant, placed by the staffing agency she had worked with for 3 years. 31 years old, possessed of a master's degree in international linguistics from Georgetown, and currently doing the work of a glorified calendar manager. She had made peace with the gap between her qualifications and her title. Peace, in Amara's experience, was something you forged out of necessity, not comfort. That morning, she stood near the back of the room with a tablet in her hand and a stillness in her posture that could be mistaken for invisibility if you didn't know better. She was there to take notes, manage the simultaneous translation feed that had been set up for the Korean delegation, and stay out of the way. The Korean delegation was there because of Kyung-han Park. He entered the room the way certain people do, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quality of presence that reorganized the space around him. He was 36 years old, the majority shareholder and acting CEO of Park Meridian Holdings, a company he had built from a regional real estate firm into a multinational investment group over the past decade. He was known in financial circles for his precision, his patience, and his absolute refusal to be rushed into anything. He sat at the head of the table with the calm of a man who had learned that stillness was its own form of authority. Beside him sat Ji-yeon Lim. Ji-yeon was 29, beautiful in the practiced way of someone who had understood very early that beauty was a form of currency and had invested in it accordingly. She was Kyung-han's fiancée, officially announced 4 months earlier at a gala in Seoul. And she wore that status the way some people wear expensive jewelry, visibly, deliberately, as a reminder of what could not be taken from her. She had accompanied him to Miami for the week, and she made it known to everyone in the office, through small, precise gestures and perfectly placed comments, that her presence was not decorative. She was watching. She was always watching. The meeting was supposed to be a preliminary negotiation with Nakamura Souza Group, a Brazilian-Japanese investment consortium that was considering a joint venture with Park Meridian for a hospitality development along the Florida coast. The deal, if it closed, would be worth approximately $2.3 billion. It had taken 14 months to get this delegation to the same table. The translation setup failed 20 minutes in. The technology glitch was minor in practical terms, a software issue with the earpiece feeds, but it was catastrophic in optics. The Nakamura Souza team's lead representative, a man named Takashi Mori, spoke limited English. His Brazilian counterpart, Renata Souza Ferreira, was fluent in Portuguese and Spanish, functional in French, and noticeably uncomfortable conducting billion-dollar negotiations in a language she didn't fully trust. The Park Meridian translator, who had been contracted from an outside firm, announced with remarkable composure that she could not resolve the technical issue from her end and would need at least 45 minutes to bring in backup equipment. The room shifted. 45 minutes, in a negotiation this delicate, was not a pause. It was a wound. Ji-yeon looked at Amara the way one looks at furniture that has disappointed them. Her voice was light, almost amused, carrying the particular cruelty of someone who understands that a smile can be the sharpest edge in a room. Can someone call the agency and ask them to send an actual professional? Or is the help we have today the best we can manage? The comment landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Several people found somewhere else to look. Amara felt it, the precise, practiced sting of it, and something in her chest did what it always did in these moments. It went quiet. Not submissive. Quiet like a coiled spring. Kyung-han had been reviewing a document when Ji-yeon spoke. He looked up. His gaze moved to Ji-yeon for a single beat, then traveled across the room and found Amara standing near the back wall. He held her gaze for a moment that was brief in seconds, but remarkably long in its quality. "Miss Ellis," his voice was measured. "Do you speak Japanese?" The room turned. Amara stepped forward from the wall. She set her tablet on the side table and straightened her jacket, and looked at Kyung-han Park with an expression that was, in its own quiet way, completely fearless. Japanese, Mandarin, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Arabic, German, and English. A pause. Not for drama, but because she believed in letting things land. "I can work without equipment." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind she recognized, the kind that meant the ground had moved. Ji-yeon's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes did. Kyung-han set down his document. He gestured toward the empty chair beside Takashi Mori, with the calm of someone who had already made the only decision that mattered. "Then please," he said, "sit down." The meeting lasted 4 hours. In those 4 hours, Amara Ellis moved between Japanese, Portuguese, Korean, and Spanish, with the kind of fluency that is not merely technical, but almost physical. A shifting of her entire self into each language. A chameleon quality that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a lifetime of practice. She caught the nuances that translation software always flattened. The formal register Takashi Mori used when he was uncertain. The particular Brazilian Portuguese idiom Renata Souza Ferreira used to signal that she was done debating and ready to decide. The way certain concepts in Korean business culture carried implications that had no precise English equivalent. She didn't just translate words. She translated intention. By the time the delegation left that afternoon, not with a signed agreement, but with a formal commitment to return in 3 weeks, which in this context was nearly the same thing, Renata Souza Ferreira had pressed Amara's hand at the door and said something in Portuguese that made Amara smile for the first time all day. She said, "That woman is worth more than this room knows." Amara had thanked her in Portuguese and meant it more than she showed. She had been collecting those moments her whole life. Small recognitions, private victories. She had learned early that the world would make her prove herself repeatedly, in rooms where others were simply assumed to belong, and she had decided somewhere along the way that proving herself was something she would do. But she would do it on her own terms, with her own tools, and she would never, ever let them see how much the proving cost. The tools had been forged over 31 years and across more countries than most people visited in a lifetime. Her mother, Diane Ellis, had been a cultural attaché with the State Department, a brilliant, restless woman who had spent Amara's childhood moving from post to post with the confident ease of someone for whom belonging was a fluid concept. Lagos at 4, Paris at 7, Tokyo at 9, Cairo at 12, Bogota at 15, Berlin at 17. At each stop, Amara had done what children do when they have no other choice. She had absorbed languages, accents, social codes, unspoken rules. She had become fluent not just in the languages themselves, but in the spaces between them, in the way silence worked differently in Japanese culture than in Brazilian culture, the way directness was a virtue in German conversation and a possible insult in Arabic. At 18, her mother had accepted a posting to Geneva and had not, this time, taken Amara with her. It was not a dramatic abandonment. There was no screaming, no slamming door. There was a conversation, careful, considered, delivered with the diplomatic precision that Diane Ellis brought to everything, in which she explained that Amara was an adult now, that Georgetown had offered a full scholarship, that she had arranged for an apartment stipend for the first year, and that this was, really, the best possible outcome for everyone. Amara had nodded. She had said, "I understand." And she had meant it, in the way you mean things when the alternative to meaning them is falling apart, and you have decided you are not going to do that. She did not fall apart. She went to Georgetown, earned her master's in 3 years instead of 4, picked up 2 more languages for reasons she could not entirely explain, except that they felt like company, and graduated into a world that looked at her resume and saw impressive, and then looked at her and calculated something else entirely. The staffing agency had been a practical decision. She was good at what she did. She moved between companies, between industries, between roles that underused her and people who underestimated her, and she accumulated money and experience and a very carefully maintained wall around the part of herself that still, sometimes, wanted to belong somewhere permanently. She had not expected Park Meridian to be different. She was revising that assessment. She was still at her desk at 7 that evening when her phone rang. She almost didn't recognize the extension. The voice on the other end was calm and direct, with the particular quality she had noticed in the boardroom, not the performative authority of someone who needed to remind you they were in charge, but the genuine quiet of someone who simply was. "Ms. Ellis, this is Kyung-Han Park. I apologize for calling this late. Do you have a moment?" She set down her pen. "Of course. I wanted to speak with you directly about what happened today. What you did in that meeting. It was not what I hired you to do. And I want you to know that I understand that. I also want to know if you'd be willing to take on a different role while you're with us." She was quiet for a beat. In her experience, conversations that began this way went in 2 directions: a genuine offer, or a polite repositioning that ended with her doing more work for the same title and the same rate. She had lived through enough of the second kind to recognize the first when she heard it. Something in his voice, the directness of it, the absence of the usual corporate cushioning, told her this was the first kind. "What role?" she asked. "The international liaison for the Nakamura-Souza negotiation. It's a 3-week engagement, minimum, and it would require full participation in every session. The compensation would be adjusted accordingly." A pause. "I would need your answer by tomorrow morning, because I'm going to need to restructure the team before the next call." She thought about it for exactly 5 seconds, which was longer than she needed. "Yes," she said. "Good." Another pause, shorter than the first. "You were extraordinary today, Miss Ellis. I hope you know that." She held the phone for a moment after the call ended, and looked at the Miami skyline going amber through the window, and felt something she had spent years building walls against. Hope. Small, careful, and entirely unwelcome. Ji-yeon had not survived 29 years of her particular life by being careless about threats. She had grown up in Seoul, in a family that moved in the outer orbit of real wealth, close enough to see it, far enough to feel the distance constantly. She was the second daughter of a property developer who had made and lost 2 fortunes by the time Ji-yeon was 15 and was working on a third with the desperate optimism of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment. She had learned from him that confidence was a performance you could not afford to break, and from her mother that a beautiful woman with the right connections could access rooms that money alone could not buy. She had acquired Kyung-han Park the way she acquired most things, through patience, positioning, and the precise application of charm at the moment when he was most likely to receive it. He was not in love with her. She was pragmatic enough to know that. But he respected her, found her company stimulating, and had concluded, with the same analytical detachment he brought to everything, that a partnership with the Lim family made strategic sense. The engagement had been mutually agreed upon. She had accepted it without illusion and without resentment. This was how the world worked, in the circles where she operated. What she had not anticipated was Amara Ellis. She had noticed Amara on her first day at the Miami office, not because Amara had done anything to attract attention, but because Ji-yeon made it her business to notice everyone in any room that contained Kyung-han. A skill developed over 4 years of being with a man who operated in rarefied spaces and was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of man that women noticed. She had categorized Amara quickly and filed her under non-threat, junior staff, contract position, no obvious social currency, the kind of competent, invisible woman who moved through corporate spaces without leaving a mark. The boardroom had reclassified everything. It wasn't just the languages, though the languages were, Ji-yeon admitted privately, genuinely arresting. It was the way Kyung-han had looked at her. She had been watching his face for 4 years, and she knew its registers, the professional mask, the rare genuine amusement, the focused intensity he brought to things that interested him. She had seen, in those first minutes after Amara stood up from the wall and spoke, something she had never seen him give anyone in a business context. Attention. Real attention. The kind that meant she had surprised him. Kyung-han Park was not a man who was easily surprised. Ji-yeon went home that evening and made a list. Not dramatic, not emotional. She didn't do either, but methodical. She was very good at methodical. The list began with a single question. What does Amara Ellis want? And the answer, which she arrived at with the efficiency of someone who understood ambition because she shared it, was simple. She wants exactly what you have. The first move was elegant in its simplicity. Ji-yeon had access to Kyung-han's professional calendar. She had been added as a secondary scheduler during the Miami trip, a practical arrangement for social engagements. She used it, over the following week, to create a series of small frictions. A meeting rescheduled so that Amara's preparation materials arrived too late to be useful. An introduction to a key Nakamura-Souza team member redirected through a different channel so that Amara's carefully drafted relationship notes never reached the right person. A rumor, seated quietly in the right conversation with the right Park Meridian executive assistant, that the agency had flagged Amara's contract for early termination due to a scope creep complaint from an unnamed client. None of these were large enough to be confronted directly. That was the genius of it. But Amara, who had spent her entire life reading between the lines of everything, felt every single one. The 3 weeks of the Nakamura-Souza negotiation were, despite everything, the most professionally alive Amara had felt in years. The work was genuinely complex. The deal involved not just a financial partnership, but a web of regulatory frameworks across 3 jurisdictions, American, Japanese, and Brazilian. And the cultural dimensions alone could have derailed the whole thing a dozen times over. Amara found herself doing things her job title had never asked of her. Mediating genuine misunderstandings between Takashi Mori's team and the Park Meridian legal department. Restructuring the agenda for one session after realizing that the Brazilian delegation's body language was signaling discomfort that had nothing to do with the deal terms and everything to do with a seating arrangement that had inadvertently placed the junior members in positions that felt disrespectful in Brazilian professional culture. Small things, invisible things, to everyone who wasn't paying attention the right way. Kyung-han was paying attention. She tried not to register the specific quality of it. He was professional. Always. There was never anything she could have pointed to as inappropriate. Never a moment that crossed a line. But he had the habit, she noticed, of listening to her in a way that most people did not. Not waiting for her to finish so that he could speak. but actually absorbing what she said, sitting with it, sometimes revisiting it 20 minutes later in a different context. He asked her questions that were not rhetorical. He revised his own positions when her reasoning warranted it, without the usual male executive discomfort about being redirected by someone lower in the org chart. He treated her mind like it was worth something. She was 31 years old, and she could count on both hands the number of times someone in a professional context had done that without a catch. The catch arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week. She came in early, as she always did, and found the draft term sheet she had spent the previous evening preparing, the one containing the restructured equity split that both delegations had verbally agreed to in the previous session, was gone from the shared drive. Not deleted, simply absent. The folder where it had lived showed no version history, as if it had never existed. She spent 40 minutes trying to recover it before the session was due to start, her stomach tight with a specific kind of dread that was not quite panic, but was its immediate neighbor. The session had to proceed without the document. Takashi Mori's team arrived expecting to see formal written terms on the table. Without them, the meeting was reduced to a verbal recap that covered the same ground they had already covered, and the Nakamura-Souza team left early, their manner noticeably cooler than it had been the previous week. Kyung-han said nothing to her about it directly, but she saw his face in the moment he realized the document wasn't there, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent her whole life reading rooms, that it was not anger she saw. It was something more complicated. He was recalibrating. She was in the recalibration. The rumor reached her that afternoon through one of the paralegals, who delivered it with the careful embarrassment of someone who genuinely liked her and was sorry to be the messenger. The word going around was that Amara had submitted the wrong version of the term sheet to the drive, and then panicked and deleted it to avoid accountability. She sat with that information for a long moment at her desk, her hands flat on the surface, her breathing deliberate. She knew exactly where it had come from. She also knew something Ji-yeon had perhaps not fully calculated. Amara Ellis had spent her entire life having the rug pulled out from under her, by people with far more practice at it than an ambitious fiancé with calendar access. She had learned, in 12 countries and 31 years of being underestimated and abandoned and repositioned and overlooked, one essential truth about herself. She did not quit. She reorganized. She found the document. It took her until 11 that night, and required navigating the building's IT backup system with a level of tenacity that the head of IT would later describe as honestly a little alarming in an impressive way. The file had not been deleted. It had been moved to a subfolder nested 3 levels deep inside a project archive that had been marked inactive in 2021. The modification timestamp showed it had been relocated at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, while Amara had been asleep and the building had been officially closed. 3 people had remote access to that system after hours. One was the IT director. One was the head of legal. One was Kyung-han Park's secondary calendar manager, a position that had been extended 6 days earlier to include temporary document access for the purpose of organizing the negotiation materials. Amara printed the timestamp log, put it in a folder, and sat with it for a very long time. She thought about what to do with it in the measured, deliberate way she had thought about every difficult decision in her life, by stripping away the emotion first, acknowledging it existed, setting it to one side, and examining the situation as it actually was, rather than as it felt. What it actually was: documented evidence of deliberate sabotage, committed by the fiancé of the man whose deal she was trying to save, who also happened to be the most professionally consequential person in her immediate orbit. What it felt like: confirmation of something she had spent her entire life fighting. The knowledge that the room was never fully hers, that there would always be someone positioned to take back whatever she had earned, that the ground was never as solid as it looked. She acknowledged that feeling. She sat with it. She set it aside. Then she made a decision. Not because she had something to prove. She was done proving. She was going to finish this deal because she had given her word that she would, because $2 billion of legitimate business deserved better than to be killed by someone's personal insecurity. and because Renata Souza Ferreira had looked at her across a conference table and seen someone worth more than the room knew. She called Renata at midnight. Renata was still awake. She was always still awake, a quality Amara admired enormously. She explained the situation in Portuguese, with the directness that Renata had told her she appreciated, and she asked for 48 hours. Renata's response was 3 words: "You have it." She told Kyung-han the next morning. Not everything, not yet. She gave him the document, with the timestamp, and she explained what she had found without editorializing, without drama, in the same measured tone she used for everything. She watched him read the timestamp. She watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness, harder, more inward. She had expected a range of reactions: disbelief, defensiveness, the careful diplomatic pivot of a man who needed to protect the person he was engaged to, regardless of what the evidence said. She had not expected him to be quiet for 30 seconds, and then say, "How long has this been happening?" The question cracked something open in her she wasn't ready for. She kept her voice even. "I believe since the 2nd week. The scheduling conflicts. The introduction that never reached Mori-san. The rumor about my contract." He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected and had not permitted himself to acknowledge. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "You didn't do it." "I know. I'm still sorry. You deserved better from this office." He paused, and something in his face shifted into a territory that was no longer purely professional. "You deserve better than a great deal of what you've been given, I think." The room was very quiet. She picked up the folder. "I'd like 48 hours to rebuild the negotiation materials and get the Nakamura Souza team back to the table." "I have Renata's agreement. I need yours." He gave it, without hesitation. She walked out of his office before either of them could say anything else, because she was 31 years old and had spent her whole life protecting herself and old habits. Even the ones you want to let go of required warning before you gave them up. The 48 hours were not kind. She rebuilt the term sheet from memory and backup notes, cross-referenced against the Japanese regulatory framework she had been researching for 3 weeks, and produced a document that was, if she was honest, better than the original, cleaner, more precisely calibrated to what both parties had been moving toward, even when the official positions were still a distance apart. She called Takashi Mori herself. She had his direct number because she had made it a point in the first week to build a relationship with him, and not just with his interpreters. She spoke to him in Japanese. In the formal register, she knew he preferred for serious conversations, and she explained that she understood his team's concern about the previous session, and that she was asking for the opportunity to demonstrate that Park Meridian's commitment to this partnership was real and complete. He listened. He asked 3 precise questions. She answered all 3 without hedging. He said he would return his team to Miami in 2 days. In the parallel hours while she was working, she was also aware of what was happening 1 floor above her. Kyung-han had a conversation with Ji-yeon. She did not know what was said. She had not asked and would not have wanted to be told. But she felt the aftermath of it in the way the building felt different the next morning. Ji-yeon was not present, and the quality of absence she left was not the absence of a visitor who had gone back to her hotel. It was the absence of something that had been a fixed point and was no longer there. Amara focused on her work. It was what she had. It was, for now, enough. The final session of the Nakamura Souza negotiation took place on a Thursday morning in late March 2024. Amara sat at the table, not at the back wall, not on the periphery, and she walked both delegations through the restructured framework she had built, in 4 languages, shifting between them with the same fluid presence she had brought to that first chaotic session 3 weeks earlier. She had added a cultural accommodation clause she had not been asked to include. Recognizing from Mori-san's careful phrasing in their phone call that there were concerns about decision-making timelines that had never been formally raised because the Nakamura team didn't believe they would be heard. They were heard. Renata Souza Ferreira looked at the clause and then looked at Amara with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something like relief. The relief of a negotiator who has been waiting for someone to see what she saw, and finally, someone has. The deal closed at 2:47 in the afternoon. $2.3 billion. 14 months of preparation. 3 weeks of almost one night of rebuilding. Takashi Mori shook Amara's hand with both of his, which was not something she had seen him do with anyone else in the room, and said something in Japanese that the Park Meridian legal team's translator, the replacement, a competent young man who had been doing his best, did not catch in time. Amara caught it. It translated, roughly, as, "The bridge between us was built by this woman." She thanked him in Japanese, formally, and kept her face composed, and went to get a glass of water so that no one would see her eyes. Ji-yeon did not disappear quietly. Amara had known she wouldn't. People like Ji-yeon, intelligent, resourceful, and operating from a position of genuine fear, which was always the most dangerous version of any of those qualities, did not accept defeat through inaction. They accepted nothing. They escalated. The escalation came on the Friday after the deal closed, in the form of an email forwarded to Park Meridian's HR department, the company's sole board members, and 3 separate members of the Korean business press. It was a carefully composed document. She had to admire the craft of it, in the abstract, that laid out what it called serious concerns about Amara Ellis's conduct during the negotiation, including an allegation of unauthorized access to proprietary systems, and a suggestion that her sudden prominent role had been facilitated through inappropriate personal relationships with senior leadership. The email also contained, appended at the end with the studied casualness of someone who has saved their real weapon for last, a 3-paragraph account of Amara's background. The abandonment, the years of contract work, the resume that moved through companies like someone running from something. The framing was precise. This was not a woman you could trust with something this important, because this was a woman who had never been trusted with anything this important, because this was a woman with no permanent home, no permanent relationships, no real roots anywhere. It was, as an attack, almost perfect, because the facts were all correct. Only the interpretation was wrong. Amara read it on her phone in the parking garage, standing beside her car, and she felt every word of it with a clarity that was physical. This was the thing Ji-yeon had understood that others often missed. Amara's real vulnerability was not professional. It was the one she had spent her whole life covering. The child who had been left behind in a series of foreign cities by the one person who was supposed to be a constant. The woman who had built herself entirely out of her own resources because no one had offered to help, and she had decided she didn't need them to. She stood in the parking garage for a long moment. Then she walked back inside. Kyung-han's office was on the 36th floor. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed the 2 minutes to collect herself, and she used them well. He was at his desk when she came in. He had already seen the email. She knew from his face, which was doing the thing it did when he was containing something significant. He looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that was not what she expected. Not the uncomfortable calculation of a man managing a crisis. Not the careful neutrality of a CEO in damage control mode. It looked very much like anger. On her behalf. "I saw it," she said, before he could speak. "I know. I was about to call you." He stood up. "Amara, I want you to know that I need to say something first." She heard her own voice, level and clear. "Everything in that email that's factual is true. I grew up in 7 countries. I've worked contract positions for 3 years. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to establish the kind of professional record that makes people automatically comfortable. Those are facts." She paused. "What they don't say is that I rebuilt a $2.3 billion negotiation from scratch in 48 hours, using skills that took me 31 years to develop, because this deal mattered, and I gave my word it would close. And it did. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said quietly. I've known who you are since that first meeting. Then you know I don't need to be defended. I need it on record that the system access allegation is false, which the IT logs will confirm. And I need this company to decide whether my work speaks for itself, or whether one person's narrative about who I'm supposed to be matters more. That's not a question, he said. Your work is the most important thing that happened in this building in the last 3 weeks. She nodded. She started to turn. Please don't leave yet. The request was quiet. It did not have the quality of a CEO speaking to a member of his team. It had the quality of a person speaking to another person, carefully, from a place they had not opened in some time. She stopped. I know this isn't the moment, he said. And I know I don't have the right to say this before I've handled what I should have handled weeks ago. But I want you to know that what you said in this room today, how you spoke about yourself, the things you've carried and built alone, I see it. I've seen it from the first day. And I think you've been invisible to everyone who should have seen you for a very long time. The room was very quiet. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been careful not to for 3 weeks. And she said the only honest thing she had. Tell me when you've handled it. And then ask me that again. She walked out. This time she did not need to collect herself. Something in her, some old coiled tension she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight, had begun, very slightly, to release. Kyung-han had been practical about his personal life for as long as he could remember. He had grown up in Seoul in a family that had not been wealthy, but had been disciplined. His father a civil engineer, his mother an accountant. Both of them people who understood the relationship between effort and outcome, with a clarity that left little room for sentiment. He had been a serious child, who became a serious young man who became a serious company. He had built Park Meridian Holdings through 15 years of calculated risk and genuine hard work, and he had arrived at 36 with a company worth considerably more than he had imagined possible when he had started it at 21, with a borrowed office and a business plan written on a train. Along the way, he had made practical decisions about most things, including the personal ones. The engagement to Ji-yeon had been practical. He had told himself, honestly, that he respected her, found her interesting, and that affection could grow from those foundations. He had not looked too closely at what was absent from that list. The 3 weeks of the Nakamura-Souza negotiation had made looking away from the list considerably harder. He had noticed Amara Ellis the way you noticed a tuning fork that had been struck in a room full of noise, not because it was the loudest sound, but because it was the most precise. She had a quality of attention that he recognized because he shared it, the habit of actually listening, of treating conversation as something to be taken seriously rather than performed. She was economical with words in the way that people are when words have always been serious business. And she moved through the world with a self-sufficiency that he understood was not coldness but armor, the particular armor of someone who had learned early that the only reliable thing was themselves. He had admired it. And then, somewhere in the second week, he had stopped admiring it from the professional distance he was supposed to maintain and had started feeling something else, something less comfortable, something that had no place in a boardroom or in the calendar of a man who was technically engaged to someone else. He had not acted on it. He had not intended to act on it. What Ji-yeon had done to the document had clarified things in a way that his own ambivalence had not managed to. Not because it proved she was capable of cruelty. He had sensed the architecture of her long before that. But because it proved that she had looked at Amara Ellis and seen a threat to a claim rather than a person. It proved that what he had allowed to continue, out of practicality and inertia, and the comfortable logic of commitments already made, had become a vehicle for someone else's damage. He ended the engagement on a Thursday night, In a conversation he kept as honest and as clean as the situation allowed. He told Jiyeon that he could not continue something he had entered into for the wrong reasons, that he took responsibility for that, and that whatever anger she directed at him was deserved. He said it without argument and without the softening language that he knew she would have preferred, and that would have been ultimately another form of dishonesty. Jiyeon listened. She did not cry. He had not expected her to. She said, with the precision of someone who was filing information for later use, "I know what changed." "I know you do," he said. "I'm sorry anyway." She left that night. The email to the board and the press went out the following morning, which he had also not quite expected but perhaps should have. He had spent Friday managing the fallout, calls to Seoul, a statement to the board, a meeting with HR, a review of the IT logs that corroborated everything Amara had shown him. And by the time Amara walked into his office that afternoon and said everything she had said, he had been as ready to hear it as he had ever been ready for anything. The IT logs were unambiguous. The timestamp placed Jiyeon's remote access at 11:47 p.m. on the night the document disappeared, and the modification trail left nothing to interpretation. Park Meridian's legal team sent a formal notice to the Lim family's attorneys within the week. There was no lawsuit. The evidence made one inadvisable, but the terms of the separation were not quiet. Jiyeon returned to Seoul. The Korean business press, which had received her email with what turned out to be considerably less enthusiasm than she had anticipated, published nothing. One journalist, it emerged later, had called the Park Meridian Communications Office for comment before printing anything, which was either professional courtesy or instinct, and the Communications Office had responded with the IT logs. The story died before it was written. Jiyeon Lim was a precise and capable woman, and she would, Amara had no doubt, land somewhere. But she would not land here. The board wanted to celebrate. The Nakamura-Souza deal was the largest in Park Meridian's American portfolio, and the Seoul leadership, who had been watching the Miami office with the cautious skepticism that head offices reserved for satellite operations, was, by all accounts, quietly stunned by the outcome. A celebration dinner was organized for the following Friday, at a restaurant in Atlanta where Kyung-han was scheduled to be for the second half of the week anyway. Amara was invited, not as staff, as the lead negotiator. The invitation was delivered by Kyung-han himself in a brief email that said, "You closed this deal. You should be at the table when we celebrate it. I hope you'll come." She read it 3 times. She accepted. Atlanta in late March had the particular quality of a city that had decided winter was over, regardless of what the temperature was actually doing. Something restless and green beginning to push through. A warmth in the late afternoon that felt like a promise rather than a fact. The dinner was at a restaurant in Buckhead that was all exposed wood and low light, and the kind of quiet confidence in its own menu that didn't require announcement. She arrived first. She always arrived first. He arrived 7 minutes later, and she noticed, with the part of her that noticed everything and filed it away, that he looked different outside a conference room. Not less composed, but differently composed, like a photograph taken in natural light rather than under fluorescence. He saw her at the table, and his face did the thing she had stopped letting herself look for, and she looked anyway. He sat across from her, and the two of them had, for the first time in 5 weeks, a conversation that was not about a deal. It started carefully. She asked him about his family, the way you ask when you actually want to know. He told her about his father, who still called him every Sunday and still gave him advice about structural engineering, despite the fact that his son had not built a physical structure in 15 years. She laughed, a real laugh, not a social one, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting to hear that sound for longer than he'd admitted. She told him, in return, about her mother. Not the edited version, not the diplomatic summary she gave when people asked. The real version. The moving. The languages. The departure. The way she had stood in a Georgetown apartment at 18 and understood that she was entirely alone, and had decided, in that moment, That alone was something she could work with. He listened the way he always listened, like it mattered, like she was worth the full weight of his attention. "You built yourself out of every place that couldn't keep you," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation, delivered with the quality of someone who recognized the architecture because they had seen it in themselves. She looked at him. "You sound like you know something about that." "I know something about building things alone," he said. "I didn't know until recently how much of what I'd built was still alone, even with people in the rooms." The restaurant was beginning to fill around them. The rest of the team would arrive in 20 minutes. "In Miami," he said, "you told me to ask you again once I'd handled it. I've handled it." He held her gaze. "Amara, I'd like to know if this, whatever this is something you'd want to explore. Honestly, and without rushing it. And with me being very clear that I understand what you've built, and I have no interest in being another temporary room you move through." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the restaurant window, Atlanta was doing what it did in March, half warm, half uncertain, entirely itself. "I've lived in 12 cities," she said finally. "I speak 9 languages. I've been everything everywhere, and nothing permanent anywhere." She paused. "Ask me in 3 months." He considered that. 3 months. "If you're still asking in 3 months, you'll have your answer." Something in his expression settled. Not disappointment. She had braced for disappointment. But something that looked far more like the particular patience of a man who had learned, through 15 years of building things that mattered, that the most important things were worth the wait. 3 months, he said, and when the rest of the team arrived 11 minutes later, he was smiling. The 3 months were not simple. The Soul Board had questions about the deal, about the negotiation process, about Amara's role, and how a contract executive assistant had become the linchpin of the company's largest American transaction. Kyung-han answered them honestly and without apology. He had made the call in the moment, and the outcome had vindicated it, and he had submitted a formal recommendation that Amara be offered a permanent position as Director of International Partnerships at a compensation level commensurate with what she had demonstrated she could do. The board had questions about the other thing, too. The engagement, the dissolution, the email Ji-yeon had sent, the story it implied. He answered those as well, with the same directness. The IT logs spoke for themselves. The board was not entirely comfortable, but they were professional people who understood documentation, and documentation had made Ji-yeon's version of events unsustainable. Amara did not stay out of it. She submitted her own account to HR, factual and precise, with every timestamp and every incident documented in the same methodical way she had documented everything since the night she had found the file. She did not frame it as victimhood. She framed it as a record of what had happened and what the company's response to it said about its values. She included, at the end, a 1-paragraph note that said she was not interested in the position Kyung-han had recommended if it had been offered as compensation for an uncomfortable situation rather than as a genuine assessment of her value. The head of HR had called her after reading it and said, with the controlled amazement of someone who had been in the field for 20 years, "I have genuinely never received a document like this." "Is it a problem?" Amara asked. "No," the HR director said. "It's going in the file as a model." The offer came 3 weeks later. She took 48 hours to consider it, called Renata Souza Ferreira to ask what she thought. Renata said, in Portuguese, "Say yes, obviously, and then come to São Paulo and tell me everything." And accepted. She went to São Paulo 6 weeks after that, on the first leg of a site visit for Phase 2 of the Nakamura Souza project, and she and Renata had dinner at a small restaurant in Vila Madalena that stayed open until midnight and where the wine was very good and the conversation was better. She told Renata everything. Renata listened, laughed in exactly the right places, and said at the end, with the directness Amara had come to love about her, You know what I admire most about you? You never asked anyone's permission. Amara had thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. The first day in her new office, on the 34th floor with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the Miami skyline, she sat at the desk for a long moment before she opened her computer. She thought about all the desks she had sat at, Lagos and Paris and Tokyo and Cairo and Bogota and Berlin and a Georgetown apartment and a dozen conference rooms and a parking garage in Miami, where she had stood with an email on her phone and decided, once more, to walk back inside. She thought about her mother, somewhere in Geneva, who had given her languages and cities and, accidentally, a certain kind of indestructibility. She had called Diane Ellis the week she accepted the permanent position, not to ask for anything, not to report in the way she had spent years reporting silently to a parent who was never quite present. Just to say, I have a city now. I have a desk that is mine. I'm not moving. Her mother had been quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she had said, in the careful way of someone who understood they had forfeited the right to say more, I'm glad, Amara. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was true, and Amara had decided, somewhere between 31 and 32, that true was a place to start. She opened her computer. She had work to do. Kyung-han asked her again at the end of June. They were in Miami, at a small restaurant near the water that he had found, because she had told him she liked places where you could hear the ocean while you ate. He had remembered. He always remembered things she said, which she was still, quietly, getting used to. It was a Tuesday evening in late June 2024, which made it exactly 3 months and 14 days since the night in Atlanta, which she had not been counting, except that she had, a little. 3 months, he said, when they had finished eating and the evening was that particular color that Miami evenings turned in summer. Coral and gold and something that felt like permission. She looked at him. This man who had looked at her across a boardroom and given her the floor without being asked. Who had listened to her in a way that was still, even now, slightly startling in its quality. Who had handled what he said he would handle, and then waited, and then asked again. I don't move around anymore, she told him. I live here now. In this city. In this job. For the first time since I was 4 years old, I'm not packing anything. He was very still in the way he was still when something mattered. I know, he said. I need you to understand what that means for me. It's not a small thing. I know it's not a small thing. That's why I've been very careful not to ask you to rush it. She looked at the water for a moment, then at him. Yes, she said. Simply, completely. He reached across the table and took her hand. And it was not a grand gesture, just his hand, warm and steady, holding hers in the way of someone who had been waiting to do exactly that and was relieved, finally, to be doing it. She looked at their hands on the table, and she thought about how she had spent 31 years becoming someone nobody could take anything away from. And how the unexpected thing, the thing she had not planned for and had not known to want, was that someone could come along and not take anything at all, could simply sit beside you, in the full knowledge of what you carried, and hold your hand. The ocean was very close. The evening was very warm. Tell me something, he said. In all 9 languages, what does this feel like? She thought about it for a moment. Home, she said. And she said it in each language, one after the other. Japanese, Mandarin, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Arabic, German, English. And with each word the meaning didn't change. It deepened. It accumulated. It became, like her, more than the sum of its parts. He listened to every single one. In March 2025, exactly 1 year after the day Ji-yeon Lim had looked across a Miami conference room and laughed, Park Meridian Holdings announced the successful completion of Phase 1 of the Nakamura-Suza Coastal Development Project, on time, under budget, and with a formal commendation from all three partner organizations citing the quality of cross-cultural management that had distinguished the collaboration from the beginning. The commendation named Amara Ellis by name. She was in the office when the announcement came through, in her own office on the 34th floor, on a phone call with Takashi Mori, discussing Phase 2. She read the email on her second monitor, while Mori-san was explaining his board's position on the expanded timeline, and she allowed herself, privately and entirely, 1 full second of something that was not pride exactly. Pride was too small a word for it. Before she refocused her attention on what Mori-san was saying, because he deserved her full attention, and she had never been the kind of person who gave anything less. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment with the commendation email open on her screen. 32 years old, 9 languages, 1 permanent city, 1 office with a view, 1 man who called every evening and still asked her questions the way he had from the beginning, like he wanted to know, not like he already did. She thought about the girl who had stood in a Georgetown apartment at 18 with nothing but herself, and decided that was going to have to be enough. It had been. It had always been enough. She picked up her phone and called Kyung-han. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did. She could hear Seoul in the background. He was at the head office for the week, and the particular quality of distance that had never, in a year of this, felt like distance. "Did you see it?" she asked. I saw it." She could hear the warmth in his voice, that quiet, deep warmth that was nothing like the boardroom version of him, and everything like the version she had been given. "They named you. They named me." A pause that was comfortable in the way that pauses between people who have earned their ease with each other are comfortable. "I'm proud of you," he said. She smiled, the real one, not the composed one, the one that had taken most of her life to let someone see. "I know," she said. "I'll see you Sunday." She hung up. She looked out the window at Miami. This city she had decided was hers. This skyline she had earned the right to look at and feel something she had not felt in 32 years of moving. She felt like she was staying. If Amara's story moved you, subscribe so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment. Which moment hit you the hardest? Share this with someone who needed to hear it today.